Hello, everybody. In this presentation, I would like to talk about Cornel West. In particular, we're going to talk about what he has to say about philosophy, what he has to say about truth, and also the extent to which existentialism seems to frame his approach to these questions and, in general, his philosophy. The source material for this is an interview that was done with Cornel West by Astra Taylor. Astra Taylor did a series of interviews of contemporary philosophers and put them into a documentary, which is both a film documentary and a text version of it. In our class, we're looking at both. We're primarily focused on the text version, but the videos are fair game as well, although they're a little short of the information that comes out of the entire interviews, which is in the textbook. So anyhow, he's a pretty interesting and popular philosopher, so let's take a look at what he has to say about things. Astra Taylor's project in putting together this series of interviews was not only to interview contemporary philosophers, but also to bring philosophy out of the academic institutions and out into the street. So I think all the interviews take place not in academic settings, but out in public in one way or another. For instance, this interview with Cornel West is recorded inside a car which is traveling through Manhattan in New York City. Anyhow, I just wanted to clarify that. In general, as I already said, Cornel West is pretty popular and well known, one of the better known figures in contemporary philosophy. He has a kind of public persona. So he's one of the reasons he's known is because he's a political activist, a social critic, and just in general a public intellectual. So it's not uncommon for him to be interviewed on contemporary questions that occupy public discussions. His most famous book is Race Matters, and so clearly, I think that's probably what he's most famous for is his work in to try and understand race relations, especially in America. That's his primary focus, I would say, but he certainly has a broad range of interest. He's extremely well read, and as you'll see, or as you already know, he's sort of, when you listen to him, he's frequently making references to all kinds of sources. So, the announced theme for this interview was the question of truth, and which is dealt with, but it doesn't seem as though much of the interview is really concerned with that, although in the background there's this whole question of what truth is and how we should think about seeking truth or sort of the search for truth. A lot is said about philosophy and what's necessary to be a philosopher, what it is and what's necessary for it. So we're going to comment on that kind of as best we can. And as I already said, it looks as though there's a good bit of influence that comes from existentialist traditions and from other philosophies that come after existentialism, but in the same vein. So West refers to them on a number of occasions. So we'll try and point out as many of those items as we can. Finally, there's also West talks about Romanticism a lot, especially near the end of this interview, and the influence that Romanticism has had on contemporary culture. So this kind of gives us a list of the topics that we would like to talk about. Well, here are some of existentialist ideas that we do find in Cornel West, and not on just one or two occasions, but frequently. You see, like, first of all, his focus on our finitude, uh, our being in the world, our concrete existence. And for him, it's very important that we look at the reality of who and what we are in a very concrete way. And that would be, when you say finitude, I mean, that's another term that could include like our limits and sort of the limited aspects of our being. And that includes our fallibility, our tendency to make mistakes about things, and our vulnerability as well. So we're not invulnerable, but we're sensitive and we can be damaged or hurt. Secondly, in the same vein, again, the realities of human existence that Cornel West wants us to live with the awareness of, or the fact of the organic nature of our being. We're flesh, we're blood. We're born of a woman, for him, from a womb, in his expression, in stank and funk. And eventually, death is in store for all of us. So he emphasizes the messiness of birth, and with respect to death, he talks about corpses that decompose. So basically, he thinks we shouldn't be too abstract in our thinking about life and about death too. We need to be more realistic, not spare ourselves the suffering that comes from looking at the hard truths about what we are and what our existence is. On the subject of philosophy, Cornel West says some interesting things, also some expected things. So he starts by saying philosophy is the love of wisdom. I mean, that's a traditional approach to saying what philosophy is. He quotes where Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living. When he makes the quote, I think he gives an actual reference as to where you could find that particular quote. So this, we discussed when we talked about Socrates, but and that what is an examined life, sort of where you question things, you question yourself first and foremost. So it's self-examination, self-questioning. And what happens if you start to live a life like this? I mean, West is the one who says you become a different kind of person, that you become transformed by this new way of looking at yourself, looking at life, where you question everything. So that's an interesting comment, that so philosophy is not just an idle curiosity, but something that can transform us if we take it seriously. Secondly, he mentions that philosophy requires discipline and courage. He has more to say about courage, and you say, in order to be a philosopher, in order to conduct this self-examination, you have to have the courage to see yourself as you actually are, and not as you want to see yourself. He uses this, refers to this quote by William Butler Yeats, takes more courage to look into the dark corners of yourself than it does for a soldier to fight on a battlefield. That's a pretty dramatic quote, but I think it's apt. It's very difficult to accept the dark corners of yourself, to see that the things sometimes that you condemn in others are also within yourself. So, but honesty, sincerity requires that kind of courage to accept that kind of thing in yourself. Discipline, I think we also talked about. I mean, in order to do philosophy, you have to be able to focus. You can't just allow automatic thinking to rule your approach to everything. And a lot of questions require that you discipline yourself. You don't allow your mind to wander. You try and maintain a focus. You have to pay attention to what's happening, and that's all a kind of discipline. You can't be, it's good to be spontaneous in some things, but in order to get to the bottom of things, you have to be able to focus, and that's a kind of discipline that's also necessary in order to do philosophy. West comments on what Plato said about philosophy, how philosophy is a kind of preparation for death and in the direction of a kind of rebirth. Not a physical death, but you could say before a new self can be born, the old self has to die. This question about in what sense philosophy is a preparation for death is an interesting question. I'm not sure we get a very complete explanation of it in what Cornel West has to say. If you remember that, excuse me, when we looked at Plato's cave, if we interpreted the interior of the cave as the world of the body and the exterior of the cave as the soul separated from the body, you can see where Plato might have been going when it looks like the direction of the philosophy is sort of the death of the body so that the soul can see things more from the purity of itself. But anyhow, I mean, there is this sense of moving in something has to let go before something new can appear. Fourthly, two things are West mentions. They're not unique to him. Music may be more unique than poetry, but I mean, previous philosophers, Martin Heidegger, in his later period, was very much interested in poetry because he thought that the poets, that what's needed is new ways of trying to think about reality, and that the poets were the ones who seemed gifted in that direction. Poets found new ways to say things, and that's kind of what philosophy needed in order to be revitalized, is new ways to think and talk about things. On other philosophers, not, traditionally music and poetry weren't considered within the realms of philosophy, but as at a certain point in history, they were more included. And music, in particular, more in modern philosophy or contemporary philosophy, I would say, there's an effort to include music in the realm of philosophy. I mean, philosophy has always been about thinking about things, talking about it, discussing, and so forth. But music is a dimension of human existence that somehow has to be included in our philosophizing. So West says that in schools of philosophy you have to study music and poetry as well as philosophy. That you're impoverished or you're diminished if you don't include those two fields in life. It's an important part of life. And so The last thing that West talks about is he, he he doesn't say it explicitly, but you could say philosophy is not asceticism, and it's not denial of pleasure, not denial of even physical pleasure. You say pleasure has its place in our life, and there is a pleasure associated with the life of the mind, and that philosophy can enliven us. It's the feeling of being awake, to be animated through the questioning of things. And I think that's kind of what he's aiming at when he's talking about this. Well, West does make some interesting statements about truth and the idea of the search for truth, or philosophy, thinking of philosophy as a search for the truth. And so he's, first of all, not so surprisingly, but he says it's no longer possible for us to think that we can know the truth once and for all. That means we can't know truth with a capital T. We can't know a fixed kind of truth. And you say that seems like traditional philosophy, Plato, etc., seemed to be aimed at sort of, when he was trying to understand the forms, to know what the truth of something was, the essence of it. But instead, we're confined. It is possible that we can know some truth, but it always has to be truth with a small t. So it's not an absolute truth, but maybe a relative truth. And even then, if you know some truth with a small t, you have to be willing to admit that you might be wrong about it. So we make mistakes. We're fallible. So sometimes you have to be willing to change your mind in the light of a better understanding. That's just part of our human condition, that the relativity of truth. We don't know things once and for all. It is interesting when he phrases this. He says we shouldn't think about truth as a set of propositions that we accept. It's not like buying into a particular perspective and saying that you have the truth from that standpoint. So it's more like you can't get to the truth, the ultimate truth. So it's more like keeping alive a kind of a way of life that continues to search for the truth. You say it's kind of like truth is related to being tied to the way to truth in a way. So you live a life where you continue to search, you try to understand, but you have to recognize that ultimately you won't know what the truth is from a final point of view. Fourthly, and I include it here because it's become almost a famous quote, that comes out of Theodor Adorno, where Adorno says that the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. And now that's like an interesting quote. But what does it mean? And how do you understand it? What suffering is he talking about? And it's not clear that what Adorno was talking about is the same as what Cornel West might interpret it as. From one point of view, you could say that the suffering, the condition of truth, has to, you have to allow people who suffer to speak and to express themselves. And then you see something, that there's a truth of existence from those who are disenfranchised, or those who are held down or dominated within society. So then you could say there's a kind of truth that appears when you allow that suffering to have a voice. And so that's, I just think it's an interesting question, how to understand this particular quote from Adorno, and sort of that there's, what suffering is he referring to? And frankly, I'm not quite sure there's, you could say that there's, and this is what I think Camus, when we talked about existentialism, that Camus is saying that there's a kind of tension between what we as human beings want out of life and what life is willing to give us. So there's a tension between those two. And you could say that tension means suffering. They don't correspond with each other. So, and you understand something true about the nature of human existence in nature when you allow that tension to be expressed. That's, just in the direction of a possible interpretation of what is an interesting quote. I think the last topic that we're going to look at, some of the things that Cornel West has to say about Romanticism and its continued influence in contemporary times, is interesting. So he makes a general claim that he thinks Romanticism has thoroughly saturated the discourse of modern thinkers. And I say, what's he mean? What's Romanticism in that regard? And I've included some phrases here which try to express that. This longing for wholeness or harmony, this belief that everything can be resolved or worked out, ultimately, and that's what we should be striving for, and that's within the realm of possibility. That's kind of a romantic notion, and it's this kind of thinking that West is talking about. And so he argues that the problem with approaching things this way, longing for wholeness and harmonizing everything, is that when you fail to achieve it, when you can't, then it feels like a failure, or you're disappointed. It's melancholia. You want to have a drink or something, and so he says it's kind of depressing. It's kind of like you set your standards too high, and then you sort of set yourself up for failure. So his response is, don't start with Romanticism. Why start from that point of view and with that kind of expectation? Instead, begin with catastrophe. Begin with disaster. As he says, wreckage, power, wreckage upon wreckage. Then try to build from that. Then you can take more solace in what you've been able to accomplish than feeling disappointment for what you haven't been able to accomplish. In the same vein, he says you can think of, you think of your own life. What do you expect out of your own existence? And people feel like time is taking away their possibilities and so forth. But he says, we should think of time more as a gift, not as a taker. Too much focus on loss. You think of that each new moment's a new opportunity. If I could think that way, I wouldn't be so dragged down or depressed about the fact that I'm getting older and that my possibilities are becoming narrower as time goes on, but that each new moment really is a new possibility in front, to accomplish something. So think of time as a giver, not as a taker. We see that Romanticism kind of competes with existentialism, so it brings existentialism back into the picture again. We can see that the Romanticist view of reality is generally positive and sort of optimistic, but you might qualify it and say it's unrealistic. And just as we could say that existentialist view of things is negative, or it focuses on negative aspects of life, and that was an accusation or a criticism of existentialism from the very beginning, that existentialism was pessimistic about things, and that also was a criticism of the philosophy of Nietzsche, for instance. And Schopenhauer, in particular, admittedly sort of said his philosophy was pessimistic. But the argument was that it may be pessimistic, but it's realistic. It's based on reality and not on sort of wishful thinking. So the existentialists always felt that it was important to look at reality the way it actually is that there's benefit in that, and that it's sort of harmful to kind of view reality from an unrealistic point of view, from the standpoint of wishful thinking, wishing it was something that it wasn't. So there's something about honesty, or this expression, intellectual integrity, and sort of being willing to look at reality in all its negative aspects, that's at least honest, and it's at least sincere. West, seems to advocate the existential point of view, that we should look at reality from a realistic perspective, but that doesn't mean that we should be pessimistic exactly, or that we should be passive because we can't accomplish the dreams and the goals that we aspire to, because it doesn't let us off the hook. We still have to strive to accomplish things, but we have to be realistic about our expectations, and keep on. West uses this term, when he's talking about the struggle for racial equality in this country, for instance, that there has to be a kind of stick-to-itiveness. Is an aspect of it. You can't stop, and even though you may never succeed, to the extent that you would like to succeed, you still have to keep working sort of towards the goals that are legitimate goals. This thing about being realistic, even, that one of the final questions that Astor Taylor asked of West is about whether or not the search for meaning is still a relative question. And he responds that he thinks it is, that it's still relevant, and it's still worth thinking about and talking about and striving for. But again, in the same vein as above, we have to be realistic about it. You can strive, to know what the meaning of your existence is, but you should also realize that you probably will never have a final answer to that question. That doesn't let you off the hook from trying to understand. So you still have to try, even though you might not be able to get to a final answer once and for all. In particular, this struggle kind of has to meet the challenge of the threat of meaninglessness in life. If you think that everything is meaningless, kind of the nihilist position, then it looks like there's nothing that you could do, the situation's hopeless and so forth. Then it looks like genuine pessimism sort of follows from that. But I don't think any of the existentialists would accept that that's where you want to end up, that you want to continue, that you create something. And this was in Camus as well. Even though he thought life was absurd, you can create something by struggling against all the forces, and so it's the struggle that makes it worthwhile. It's not that you can achieve the results. It's not that you can change things once and for all, but your effort to actively resist the way things are is a movement in the right direction. I don't know how this fits in exactly with some of the other materials we've commented on, but I thought it was interesting that what does Cornel West have to say about religion? In the interview, at a certain point, he says he's a Christian, And it's, it's refreshing. Whatever your point of view is about religion, it's refreshing to hear a philosopher say that express his religious beliefs or his religious point of view, because you don't hear it very often. West, qualifies it, right? So he says he's a Christian, but at a certain point he says he's a Jacobian Christian, and you would say right away whatever that means, and and he doesn't explain, and people have inquired about it. I haven't heard him give a specific response to it or explanation about what he means. If what do you mean a Jacobian Christian? And then Chekhov, I'm thinking he's referring to Anton Chekhov, a writer and playwright, was certainly not a romantic writer. He wrote about reality as he saw it, and it wasn't positive in the sense of, or optimistic in the sense of Romanticism and so forth. In Chekhov, you don't find happy endings, so it's more of life as it actually is, including all its suffering and so forth. And but what kind of Christian was Chekhov? A Christian? And if you look at it, I wasn't sure how to answer this question for a long time, so I just recently did a little reading about Chekhov and saw that he came out of a Christian background and a kind of Russian Orthodox background, I think, and he very much had the morality of a Christian, of a believer. But I think intellectually he would have struggled to believe much that Christians are asked to believe. But the lifestyle he lived, and he cared about people, he tried to serve people and help people and so forth. And so he lived a good life. So in a sense, he was a Christian, kind of without believing in Christian teaching, I think. So living a Christian life, serving others, but not believing in revelation. So I'll leave it for you to figure out how that works, or is that what Cornel West sort of endorses, or feels is a kind of an appropriate model? Cornel West himself, I think, was the son of a Baptist minister, and frequently is engaged in discussions with other religious figures. So I think he takes his religious beliefs seriously, but it's a little confusing to know exactly what his position is with respect to standard organized religion. This is our last slide, and it's basically a quotes, or a series of quotes found on page 4 and 5 of our text, and I've kind of freely edited and emphasized some of it. So, but it seems to be a place where Cornel West talks about what it means to live the life of a philosopher in the present moment, and I found it an interesting expression. So he says in these quotes, I think philosophy is all about lived experience. So that's, again, I'm going to comment while we go through this, but lived experience means that's kind of existentialist approach to things. It's about how the experience we have of actually living. I think philosophy is all about lived experience. It's fundamentally about how you come to terms with living your life and trying to do it in a wise manner. And for me, I would say, and to be intelligent in the way that you live. And for me, that means decently and compassionately and courageously and so forth. And then just a little after that, he says, then philosophy itself becomes a critical disposition, and I've highlighted critical disposition just like I highlighted lived experience above. But philosophy becomes a critical disposition. It means, thinking about what you're doing, adopting a critical attitude or point of view about it all, not just taking things on their surface value. So it becomes a critical disposition of wrestling with desire in the face of death, wrestling with dialogue in the face of dogmatism, and wrestling with democracy, trying to keep alive a very fragile democratic experiment in the face of structures of domination. So some of this, if you look at it, at one point I wanted to ask students to provide their own expressions of what they thought a philosophical life would be. And I think some of this, applies to me. Some of it not so much. Some of it I'm mystified by. But I like the first paragraph. That living your life, trying to intelligently and so forth, and include all that. Then you say that philosophy becomes a critical disposition. It's not like philosophy. If you live a philosophical life, it's not like philosophy is a separate compartment of your existence. It means it becomes incorporated in who you are and becomes a part of your life. And this phrase, wrestling with desire in the face of death, that I'm unclear as to how to understand that. So I understand that we have desires and they have to be struggled with and so forth. And at a certain point, we're all going to die. I understand wrestling with dialogue in the face of dogmatism, being willing to engage people from different points of view. People become dogmatic, they become fixed in their viewpoints, but you still want to keep the dialogues open, and that seems like a good thing to do. Wrestling with democracy, trying to keep alive very fragile democratic experiments. That's, for some, that might be a primary focus. I'm not so political in that way. But I think it'd be interesting to think about, what is it that you struggle with or I struggle with, and that we might want to include underneath the heading of philosophical life for myself. So anyhow, I think West is an enjoyable read. He stimulates thought, and he's eloquent and kind of charming. He's easy to relate to, and so forth, personable. So for me, it's a good segment. So I hope you enjoyed it.